right.
Westminster has always gloried in the trappings of power. But as we near the end of the 20th century, the trappings could soon be just about all that's left to the mother of parliaments. Polls show deep public disquiet about politicians and a political system that seems to have more to do with Victorian melodrama than with modern government. As Westminster's stage armies mouth their well-worn war cries, is this the sound of a parliament out of tune with its electorate?
By selling their story to the press.
Here at the heart of Britain's body politic is a weakness, a malaise that's been eating away at our parliamentary democracy, almost without anyone noticing. The tide of power is ebbing away from Parliament. It's going to Europe, it's going to the judges, it's going to the press, it's trickling down to unelected quangos, it's flowing away to ministers, anxious to strengthen an already mighty, perhaps over-mighty executive. The result? An enfeebled House of Commons and a growing number of MPs who say Parliament's not up to the job.
Until we have a far more effective relationship between Parliament and the Prime Minister, we will merely be demonstrating that power has moved increasingly to the Prime Minister and those round and about him, and Parliament is not making any sensible attempt to redress that situation.
We have a supine Parliament, in my view, which is overridden time and time again by an aggressive authoritarian government.
We have reached a critical moment, if you like, in what is happening to our democracy, and I think it's right that there should be the public debate that is now growing over all these changes.
Do you sense that there is a good deal of public disillusionment with the way Parliament operates?
Yes, that's obvious. It comes out in every way. Comes out in the public opinion polls, but talking to people all over the country and in one's own constituency, yes, it becomes blatantly obvious.
If ever there was a case of Westminster the ruling farce, it could be seen in the handling of the Disabled Persons Bill this summer. The blocking of the bill, designed to give the disabled greater rights, underscored concern about Parliament's Byzantine methods of doing business. The government, in the person of Nicholas Scott, then Minister for the Disabled, was against the bill.
Are you going to resign, sir? I'm going to work on behalf of disabled people.
He argued it would cost too much, a claim disputed by the disabled lobby. But Mr. Scott and his colleagues didn't want the odium of being seen to oppose the measure. So, in public, they made sympathetic noises. In private, they persuaded tame backbenchers to table amendments designed to kill the bill. Unfortunately for them, the plot became public, and Mr. Scott was forced to apologise.
Personal statement, Mr. Nicholas Scott.
Madam Speaker, I very much regret that by not giving a fuller explanation at the time, the effect of my reply was misleading, and I offered my unreserved apologies to the House.
What upset the campaigners outside the House of Commons was the cynical way they felt they'd been used by the government to score points in the meaningless round of parliamentary party games.
Democracy used to lie with the Parliament and was implemented by the Cabinet. Now we're in a situation where the Cabinet, the executive, make all the decisions. They don't ask the people, they don't talk about rights, they don't talk about what people may want. They tell them, this is what you're going to get, we are always right, we know what you want, and you're just going to have to do what you're told.
The most obvious symptom of Parliament's inadequacy is that MPs just aren't getting the legislation right, whether it's the Child Support Agency or the Criminal Justice Act. Forget politics, they're passing laws that just don't work. Badly drafted, full of loopholes, and able to cause quite unintended misery to ordinary people. Take rail privatisation. To slice through the political furore surrounding it, the government cut short debate in the Commons by using the guillotine procedure. The result? They left out a vital technical clause giving the Transport Police jurisdiction on railway property. Parliament's now passed a special bill so the police can operate freely. Unfortunately, so can the criminals, because the bill's still not right.
At the end of March, we discovered, purely by chance, that certain offences that have been on the statute for many, many years no longer apply to the new railways. And they include trespass and stone throwing and acts of vandalism on the railways. We have something like 18,000 offences, or this type of offences, on the railway each year. So at the moment we have something like 6,000 offenders getting away scot-free. We're unable to deal with them because of another defect that's been found in the Railways Act. Our opinion, obviously, of Parliament and particularly the Department of Transport is worsening day by day.
Just on the grounds that they don't seem to know how to run a railroad.
Well, they don't seem to know how to write an Act of Parliament either.
The Transport Police have started arresting people again, but they're expecting their rights of arrest to be challenged in the courts. The Dangerous Dogs Act was another law rushed through the Commons, this time after a press outcry.
I can tell the House from midnight tonight the import of dogs bred for fighting, such as the American Pit Bull Terriers and Japanese Tosers, will be banned. Such dogs have no place in our homes.
The Dangerous Dogs Act was meant to be tough, but as usual, the Commons botched the detail. The real flaw is that the bill made no allowances for dogs like Dempsey, now in police custody, a pit bull with an affectionate temperament. Dempsey's distraught owner, Diane Farriman, has been fighting for her pet's life in the courts for 2 years, and the case may go to the House of Lords. No one believes Dempsey's dangerous, and she fulfilled the stringent requirements of the new Act. She was condemned purely on a technicality.
Dempsey was being walked by a friend of the family, and she got sick in the street. He had to take the muzzle off. She was fighting to get it off to reach, to be sick. And he was rushing to get her back home, you know, quickly, because she wasn't too well. And there was a police car going past. And of course they saw her unmuzzled and followed him to the top of the street and stopped him. He was fined £50 and the instruction order was put on the dog.
Dempsey is just one of hundreds of pets now on death row. Their owners are trying to defend them in the courts, usually on the grounds that they're not purebred fighting dogs. The cost to the taxpayer is put at over £2 million in London alone. So what went wrong?
Media awareness was at its height, and effectively it was a knee-jerk reaction by the government in response to that. The problem therefore was that it was drafted in haste, and the courts are now having to cope with the effect of that speed. I think the use of one word instead of another might have saved the taxpayer an awful lot of money and a large number of dog owners a great deal of heartbreak. If the legislation used the word may order destruction rather than shall order destruction, I don't think you would have seen nearly so many cases coming before the courts. Owners, if they're faced with the death of their dog or nothing else, will fight to the end.
The fighting seems to have paid off. We have discovered that the Dangerous Dogs Act is going to be sidelined. The Home Office is quietly steering the prosecuting authorities back to the 1871 Dogs Act with a circular which says they might welcome the availability of powers short of destruction. Few understand the handicaps of parliamentary procedure better than Michael Ryle. An officer of the House for nearly 40 years, he finished his career as clerk of the committees, responsible for servicing, among others, the standing committees of the House, whose job it is to scrutinise new legislation. He's dismayed by what he sees as the complete inadequacy of the system.
Well, I'm afraid I have got very grave reservations about the whole legislative process. I was involved recently with a commission for the Hansard Society on the legislative process, and we issued a long report called Making the Law. And at each stage we found very, very serious defects. I think what has happened is a system, a machinery which probably worked quite well in the Victorian times or even in the earlier years of this century when there was much less legislation, is really creaking now.
I've served in 3 governments, Ted Heath's, Margaret Thatcher's and John Major's. And every year we said there is too much legislation, we must do less next year. We never actually achieved this golden mean, but there has got to be an effort to reduce the amount of legislation going through. We must have a self-denying ordinance on that because there is too much going through at the moment. It's very difficult to absorb.
Far too many bills come into the House what might be called half-baked, not properly thought out, not fully drafted even. There hasn't been proper careful consultation outside with the experts and with the interested groups and the affected parties.
So why are MPs allowing so much legislation to be rammed through with so little thought? Well, the impetus comes from ministers. The executive's always been powerful, but many believe that over the years government has been gradually tightening its grip on Parliament. And MPs, all too conscious of government patronage, have been conniving at that process.
The reason that we have a system whereby the government has very effective control, normally, is because behind them, on the backbenches, are a whole army of people who want to be ministers.
Questions to the Prime Minister, Mr. Colin Shepherd.
How's this for a question?
Will my right honourable friend reflect upon the fact that over the last year, industrial output in the United Kingdom rose. Will he confirm, Madam Speaker,
yes, I'm sure
that it is still permissible to publish good news in this country?
Madam Speaker, I think that good news certainly is allowed. I fear it is often perhaps masked.
The whole operation of the House of Commons today is much more dominated by people who see politics as a profession.
There's not enough, if you like, sensible rebellion. You can get away with almost anything with a large majority, and we saw that over the community charge. I've never been present at such a reluctant vote. I was a rebel myself, but I mean the reluctance was from the front bench going all the way backwards, and we paid the price for that. Now, in a more independent frame of mind, with a more independent Parliament, we might be spared some of these aberrations.
The poll tax debacle underlined as nothing else the government's power to steamroller unpopular measures into law. On a free vote, the poll tax would never have got through Parliament in the form it did. Many of the government's own backbenchers had deep misgivings about it. It was the government's business managers, the whips, who held out the lure of promotion to some, browbeat others, and forced it onto the statute book. The whips, on both sides, have been acting as Westminster's thought police for nearly 400 years. Right now, the Tories' slender majority is giving the government whips an uphill task. Even so, MPs on all sides complain that the balance has tipped too far, that party discipline has become a parliamentary straitjacket.
I'm afraid that's you, yeah.
The whips are very powerful, and that's what they're there for. They're the school prefects. They do manage to exert pressures on people. They do remind people of their mortality, political mortality.
One of the criteria for ministerial office is the ability and the willingness to take the sort of hard decisions that governments have to take and to defend them, and not to jump up and down every 5 minutes simply because there is something that you happen to disagree with.
It is said on the backbenches, certainly when Mr. Tristan Garrell-Jones was Deputy Chief Whip for many years, that you really didn't get any promotion unless you got your MOT certificate, which meant Mate of Tristan.
There are some members of Parliament, they're perfectly entitled to take this point of view, I hasten to say, whose parliamentary life consists in indulging themselves every time they disagree with something the government does. Now, that's fine. But if the whole of Parliament did that, then you wouldn't be able to run an administration in Britain.
Who would want to go into Parliament today? First of all, you don't get very well paid. The hours and conditions of work are terrible, and you have very little power or influence. I mean, one of the reasons why so many MPs resent the press is because they know we have far more influence on British society and British politics than they do. I mean, you really have to be a cabinet minister to come anywhere close to a newspaper's influence. And so you have a lot of rather surly, not very bright, ineffective people sitting in the House of Commons, unable to control the executive, cannon fodder for the whips when the whips need them to be. I mean, that if you were to advise a bright, young Oxbridge graduate future, you would hardly say to he or she that this is the kind of career that your parents would like you to go into.
Better be a journalist. The press has always been influential. 2 centuries ago, Edmund Burke told the Commons the Fourth Estate was more powerful than they. But today, the decline of Westminster has made the press look more powerful still. Today, the media is exerting ever more control over the political agenda, and questions in the House make little impact unless the media takes them up.
There's a real danger here in that as Parliament continues with its faults and does not correct them, more and more members, particularly perhaps the more active and public ones, known ones, do see the answer as going on the media to create change. But there's a real danger for government here that too many of us see that we can't get anywhere perhaps on the floor of the House, and even less in a committee here, but we go out on that green out there and the public hears us, and of course we then further the agenda, which has been, I may say, so probably mutually set.
It has been extra-parliamentary institutions, and certainly way outside the House of Commons, that has produced both the final inquiry into Maastricht Churchill and the great public scepticism about the Pergau Dam incident, in which our money has been used to build a dam that nobody wanted. I mean, in both cases you have serious question marks over the abuse of executive power and the abuse of taxpayers' money. Well, it was not the investigative prowess of the House of Commons or any select committee that really got to the bottom of this in either case. It was the press.
The feebleness of Parliament in holding the government to account has left something of a constitutional gap. The gap's been filled sometimes by the press, though erratically. But now, crucially, there's another group that's stepped into the breach, the judges. They're determined to put a check on ministers who exceed their power. And the rising ascendancy of the executive has been matched by the increasing vigilance of the judiciary.
I don't think we ever have relied just on Parliament to protect our rights. Historically, the judges have always seen, and the courts have always seen, perhaps the most important of their functions as being the protection of the rights of the citizen against encroachment by anyone, originally the King, the Church, but equally Parliament, the executive, any overmighty body. And people regard it as more important to protect the rights of the citizen than to protect the continuity of government, if one calls it that.
Edward Rogers, first-class honours.
Senior judges, like Sir Thomas Bingham, the Master of the Rolls, still wear their traditional robes, but they've cast off much of their traditional deference towards the executive. They've started developing new ways of reviewing government decisions and, where appropriate, overturning them. Within strict legal limits, they've become a steadily more important constraint on ministers.
There is so much legislation, and in a sense there is so much government, that the role of Parliament as a watchdog over the executive has become weaker, partly perhaps because the executive has become bigger and stronger.
It was not Parliament but the judges who forced the government to recognise the legal rights of asylum seekers coming to Britain. In May 1991, the 23-year-old Zairian teacher was deported to Kinshasa despite his plea that he faced political persecution. The court allowed him leave to return for a hearing, but the Home Secretary of the day, Kenneth Baker, ignored the ruling and kept him out. The judges found Mr. Baker guilty of contempt of court.
I am not blaming anybody. The decision that was taken on May the 2nd was mine. And I make it absolutely clear I will answer for that decision.
Ministers are subject to the law of the land in the same way as everybody else, and liable to penalties if they breach it. I mean, happily, ministers have observed orders of the court, but there shouldn't be really any question about it, and it shouldn't be a matter of indulgence on their part. It should be a very clear legal rule that they comply. That has now been made plain beyond any argument.
Back in the Commons, MPs admit that the judge's success in defending the rights of citizens against overmighty government is another measure of Parliament's failure.
The better this place is doing, the less judicial review you will have. The more judicial review you have, and the more them out there are looking to that rather than here, of course, the worse this place is doing.
No, what has happened is that far too many ministers, far too often, have gone beyond the bounds of their power. And that's why you have more and more cases coming up before the courts. And the judges saying, I'm sorry, but this is beyond your power. And that is part of our constitutional arrangement, and a very sound part.
Why do you think that ministers over the last few years have increasingly started going beyond their powers?
Because they thought they knew better than anybody else.
Just the arrogance of long years in power?
Yes.
In any decent democracy, Parliament should have a mechanism for curbing arrogant ministers. As Gladstone said, the job of the Commons is not to run the country, but to hold to account those who do. Well, the Mother of Parliaments does have a vehicle for scrutinising government departments and calling them to answer, the select committees. But are the committees really up to it?
We have a government-dominated Commons, a government-dominated legislature, so dominated as to be unhealthy in my view. What we need is much more awkwardness in Parliament, more abilities to stop the government, whatever government, and particularly awkward, aggressive select committees asking difficult questions of ministers. This happens sometimes, but it doesn't happen often enough, and there's nothing finer. Parliament is its best, in my view, when it's screwing some minister to the wall over some policy or error that he's made.
Morning. We're very busy yet?
The trouble is, despite the glories of the Commons Library, select committees have little backup in terms of research staff, while the ministers they monitor have entire departments of officials briefing them. Worse still, the independence of these all-party committees is undermined by the whips. Conservative Nicholas Winterton used to chair the Health Select Committee. Its reports were a constant thorn in the government's side. When the maverick Mr. Winterton, aided by the press, proved difficult to ignore, the whips went to work.
The whips brought influence upon the Selection Committee, which created a new rule which I describe affectionately, and so does the House, as the Winterton rule, to create a situation in which Nick Winterton couldn't be reappointed to the Health Select Committee, because if I had been reappointed, I'm confident that the committee would have reappointed me as chairman, and the government didn't want that.
Nicholas Winterton is a Member of Parliament who, in my first Parliament in the Whip's office, voted against a Conservative three-line whip on 53 occasions. Now, I'm sure he'd be prepared to answer for each and every one of those, but I don't think he could be described as a loyal team-playing member of the Conservative Party, and not surprisingly, the Whip's office take a pretty dim view of that.
Parliament should reflect the views of the people of this country, and I think the involvement, the interference, the pressure brought by the Whip's office to prevent people saying what they believe should be said is undermining the credibility of integrity of Parliament in the eyes of the people.
I myself voted with enormous pleasure for the removal of Nicholas Winterton from that particular committee, and I have never known an atmosphere of such joy and pleasure in the Conservative Whip's office, in the Conservative lobby, as when we were invited to cast that particular vote.
I think that the Whips and the establishment should keep their sticky fingers out of all matters relating to the Select Committee, and they should not seek to influence the Selection Committee of the House of Commons as to who sits. The Selection Committee should look at those who apply to serve on a Select Committee and make that selection on the merits of each individual application. Otherwise, the whole Select Committee system becomes merely another organ of government which completely destroys the whole purpose of the Select Committee system.
One of the great checks on government power has long been Britain's politically neutral civil service, carefully steering its ministerial masters away from anything unsound, let alone improper. But now civil service propriety is one of the key issues in Lord Justice Scott's inquiry into the sorry affair of arms exports to Iraq. The investigation is raising questions about civil servants' impartiality, and it's underlining wider concerns that after 15 years of Tory rule, some officials may be too close to their ministers, too compliant.
I don't believe that the civil service has been politicised in the crude sense of everybody saying, well, actually, you know, we're all Tories now. That I don't believe. What I do believe is that civil servants believe that in order to get on, they've got to give the ministers the advice that they actually want to hear.
Such concerns are being lent special urgency by the breakup of the old monolithic Whitehall machine. Evolution, not revolution, used to be Whitehall's motto, but suddenly the civil service is being engulfed by change. Its Rolls-Royce engine is faltering as it struggles to reconcile new business methods with its public service traditions.
We've had, as it were, initiative after initiative sweeping through the civil service over a relatively short period of time, 5 to 10 years, starting with the creation of the agencies, going on from that to contracting out, then to market testing, then privatisation rears its head again. And what I think has happened is that a large number of civil servants are bewildered by that, by the speed with which it's happened. And because they don't know whether they're coming or going, are considerably anxious about their jobs and their future. And all of that, as it were, causes people to be distracted from, as it were, their single-minded public service commitment, because they are more worried about themselves, perhaps, than some aspects of public service.
Some fear that hiving off most of the civil service into semi-autonomous agencies has weakened the line of accountability that stretches back through Whitehall and ministers to Parliament. But when it comes to unelected, mainly government-appointed quangos, up to 5,000 of them spending an estimated $46 billion a year, that line of accountability sometimes snaps altogether.
I don't think the government has actually thought it through. I don't think they deliberately set out, haven't deliberately said, well, we will undermine parliamentary democracy and accountability by setting up all these quangos. It's really ad hoc decisions about policy and so on, which has led to all these quangos all over the place, which cannot be controlled directly by Parliament or by ministers in some instances.
That if I were an MP wanting to find out exactly what was happening and why in a particular part of the country through some of the quangos, I think I would find it very much more difficult than it used to be.
Back in the Commons, about the only MPs who have any success in getting to grips with quangos are members of the powerful Public Accounts Committee, whose task it is to examine public spending and ensure that the taxpayer is getting value for money. The Welsh Development Agency was one quango whose penchant for providing unacceptable perks to its staff was revealed by the Public Accounts Committee. The committee named the Welsh Development Agency, along with a dozen or so other quangos, as having acted either improperly or incompetently. Mrs. Thatcher had praised the agency for attracting huge foreign investment.
This man's done a fabulous job. The Welsh Development Agency, fabulous job.
But in its report, The Proper Conduct of Public Business, the Public Accounts Committee condemned the failings it had uncovered in this and other public bodies. It said they represented a departure from the standards of public conduct established by the Victorians 140 years ago. Mind you, few failings were quite as spectacular as those of the Welsh Development Agency.
They recruited not just a con man, but a crook. I mean, a 24-carat crook. He'd had 3 terms in jail in the United States, and he was brought over and given enormous advantages and financial means, and he entertained models in his hotel room on a Sunday afternoon to decide which ones of those. I mean, these are sort of things you cannot do with public money.
It's the National Audit Office that gives teeth to the Public Accounts Committee. Although it reports to the committee, the Audit Office has freedom to instigate its own inquiries, and its 800-strong staff have full powers to demand access to any relevant documents. But there are some quangos whose books it does not have the right to see, though the MPs want this changed. They believe it would substantially strengthen their investigative powers. It was the Audit Office that uncovered the hidden sweetness paid in the British Aerospace Rover deal, as well as those strange goings-on in the Welsh Development Agency. Goings-on which ministers and civil servants in the Welsh office should have known about.
That investigation surfaced quite a wide range of material dealing with redundancy schemes, recruitment mechanisms, early retirement of key staff, operations in North America, private mileage in official cars. There was a range of material, it wasn't just a single topic.
The Welsh office didn't know what was going on.
They certainly weren't aware of those particular breakdowns.
Doesn't that suggest that sometimes the theory of accountability, that the minister knows what's going on and can answer in Parliament for everything that his office is responsible for, quite often doesn't match up to the reality?
That underlines the crucial importance of parliamentary audit. We're there to bring attention to those matters which have fallen outside the net and where breakdowns in procedures have occurred.
The worry for Parliament is that all too often its committees don't know what's going on in sufficient detail.
If you take a select committee, which should be the means by which Parliament examines in detail what is happening in government, the modern select committees were set up to examine one government department. But today, a typical select committee will have to examine one departmental headquarters, half a dozen agencies, 50 maybe quangos, and thousands of contracts. And the machinery of government is running too far ahead of the machinery of Parliament. We no longer have the means of keeping track of a dismembered civil service, which is what has happened.
I think the net effect of all the changes that we've seen has certainly been to increase the power of the executive. And I think we need, in a sense, a new constitutional framework. We need to sort of pause for a moment and say, hold on, what is this doing to our parliamentary democracy? Should we have new constitutional checks? Are there certain things that now need to be done in order to ensure that we have more accountability in the system?
Perhaps if MPs were more robust about defending the rights of citizens, they might win back some of the public respect and support they've lost. As it is, people who'd once have looked to Parliament to protect their interests are going elsewhere. Parliament didn't protect Helen Marshall from being forced to retire earlier than she wanted, simply because she's a woman.
Now, I know one person's liberty is another man's restraint, but I felt that I should be entitled to plan my own life, and I felt that I was entitled to make the decision whether I would work and be financially independent, or whether I would take a pension and be a cost on the community.
Miss Marshall started out with the idea that the laws of Westminster would surely guarantee her equal treatment with men. She fought her way through the British courts, but lost because the British Sex Discrimination Act specifically excluded the age of retirement. But today, there is a higher law than that of Westminster. Miss Marshall took her case to the European Court in Luxembourg and won. Westminster had been overruled, but the victory turned out to be a Pyrrhic one for her personally, because of British limits on compensation. So she went back again to Europe to get that changed.
British law has a ceiling on the level of compensation that can be awarded, and that ceiling was too low to cover my losses. So I took the same route and went back to Europe, and Europe awarded the principle that the compensation must be adequate for the losses that had been sustained, and upheld the principle of equal treatment.
In case C-271-91, Marshall against Southampton and South West Hampshire Area Health Authority. The Court.
While political debate over Europe rages at Westminster, many individuals, like Miss Marshall, are finding European law gives them broader rights than in Britain.
Sustained by a person injured as a result of discriminatory dismissal may not be limited to an upper limit fixed a priori, or by excluding an order of interest
Indirectly, this court is bringing into the British legal scene ideas and ways of looking at the law which weren't there or weren't there as strongly before. For example, the notion of individual rights. British law has tended in the past to look at individual freedom, the freedom from interference by the state. On the whole, the continental systems have looked at the right to certain things.
It's not just in one-off judgments that Europe is influencing the British courts. Its law is influencing the whole approach of our judges and encouraging them to be far more active in defending the rights of citizens against the state. History has taught other Europeans to be wary of a laissez-faire attitude to people's rights.
Other countries have had experience of dictatorship, of totalitarian, authoritarian, arbitrary rule. They have had to develop legal techniques to protect the citizen against the power of the state. We did not until relatively recently, or at least we thought we didn't have to. And therefore we've come relatively late to a phenomenon which affects everybody. The state actually does far more in the life of the individual than it used to do. And therefore the idea of positive rights is important to the individual. Ordinary people, and I think particularly women, are aware that community law has opened new fields to them which they could not have prized open for themselves under the law as it stood in Britain without the community.
Former Army Captain Abigail Kirby Harris is one of thousands of women indebted to the pioneering efforts of Miss Marshall. The Colonel Blimps in the Ministry of Defence forced her to resign her commission when she became pregnant. But thanks to Europe, she can now sue the ministry for over £500,000 in lost pay and pension.
I announced with tremendous pleasure that at my advanced age that I was pregnant and better start making some plans, and they said, well, you better start writing your resignation letter, which of course I refused to do. I wrote instead and asked officially for maternity leave, but they said, nice try, but I'm afraid it's just not on. The law doesn't include you. I'd just come back from a visit to France, where I had been looked after very nicely by a young female officer who was the mother of a 5-year-old and a 1-year-old, and it seemed to work very well for her. It just never crossed my mind until I came up against this brick wall.
Once again, women were worse off under English law, and despite all that pious talk of how Britain always keeps Europe's rules, the Ministry of Defence flouted this one. Now it's paying the price.
Some people would say that it isn't fair that the government should have to pay out large sums just because of European law, because the law has changed.
Well, I think it serves them jolly well right. How they could possibly have expected to exclude quite a large section of the female workforce from their legislation beggars belief. I simply do not understand the reasoning that we, who didn't bear arms, didn't receive weapons training, were not fighting soldiers, somehow had to be excluded as though we were fighting soldiers. I think it's absolutely crazy, and I don't know who it was that nobbled the law so that we were all cut out from it, but more fool them.
Europe has also come to the defence of other groups in Britain.
It was here at Brixham in Devon that William of Orange landed in 1688 at the start of the glorious revolution which finally established the supremacy of Parliament some 40 years after the end of the English Civil War between parliamentarians and royalists. Today's Brixham fishermen, like those in other ports, looked to Parliament to protect them when their interests were threatened. But they quickly became disillusioned with Westminster-style democracy. MPs were strong on sympathy, on moral support, but they proved impotent to influence events.
British fishermen know from hard experience just how powerful are the laws of Europe when it comes to maintaining a free market. In the late 80s, Spanish fishermen bought British ships and started fishing our waters. The British government, pushed by the trawlermen, passed an Act of Parliament to keep them out. The Spaniards appealed to the European Court, which intervened and set aside the British Act of Parliament. Known as the Factortame case, after one of the firms involved, it was a legal landmark. It demonstrated something that had been true, though overlooked, ever since Britain joined the common market more than 20 years ago.
I think the Factortame case brought home to everybody in a much more acute way than had been done before the fact that the law of the community is supreme, and if a United Kingdom statute is inconsistent, then it must be amended. I think it hadn't been generally realised up to then by great sections of public opinion. If there was any conflict between the law of a national state and the law of the community, it was the law of the community that had to prevail.
It was a lesson our fishermen took to heart. When the British government planned a new law limiting the number of days they could spend at sea, ironically to ensure they stayed within European fish quotas, the fishermen lobbied Parliament, with the usual results. Oceans of sympathy, but when it came to the vote, most Tory MPs allowed themselves to be netted by the whips.
Fishing constituency MPs really couldn't represent the interests of their own constituents, their own members, and that was very sad. I think we're increasingly sceptical over the actual parliamentary process, the lobbying process. How effective can we be if effectively all they're going to do is listen to what the government is saying?
Fishermen who've been blockading Plymouth Sound since early this morning. 150 boats took part in the action, which prevented a passenger ferry and 3 Royal Navy frigates from entering the harbour.
The fishermen, finding that Westminster had failed them again, tried other avenues. Their waterborne protests hit the headlines, but it was their appeal to European law that did the business.
We managed to get a referral to the European Court of Justice, and that again nullified the legislation. The government effectively couldn't do anything. We stopped them from actually bringing in the Act altogether.
So what happens now?
What happens now is that we wait maybe for a year, maybe for 2 years to hear what the European Court of Justice has to say. And if the government is successful, they'll probably try and reintroduce the Act. If we're successful, then we'll destroy the Act in its entirety. There's always a gut reaction against the European Parliament and the European community. But at the end of the day, I think the way things are developing and the hostility that we have towards our own government and the way that everything seems to be dictated to from Brussels now, we're probably going to even looking at bypassing the British parliamentary system altogether and have direct representations into Brussels.
In Brussels, within 100 metres of the European Commission building itself, are the offices of the man who helped the British fishermen stop a Westminster Act of Parliament dead in its tracks. Fergus Randolph is a London lawyer, now based in Brussels, who knows the Treaty of Rome inside out. Lining up behind the fishermen, he has other clients preparing to take the legal road to the European Court in Luxembourg. Ahead, he says, lie a whole range of cases which the British Parliament at Westminster may think it can control, but he predicts they will come up against the implacable reality of European law.
A good example of this is the workers' councils. These have not yet arrived, but they will do, and the 11 member states at the moment will effectively create these workers' councils so that workers may be consulted in certain circumstances. What happens with a multinational? The continental subsidiaries will be forced to have workers' councils, whereas the English-based employees will not have the opportunity and rights under those workers' councils. How is that going to work? Simply by virtue of the fact that one is moved from, say, France to England, does that mean that one loses one's rights? This, it would seem to me, would be in straight contravention of the non-discrimination provisions in the Treaty of Rome under Article 6. It is strictly forbidden for there to be any discrimination on grounds of nationality. We've always thought of the House of Commons as being the mother of parliaments, the maker of our laws, but now we have another maker of laws, another giver of laws, and that is in Luxembourg. The power is ebbing away from the national parliaments and coming towards Brussels or Luxembourg or the Euro centres, if you like.
It was Sir Edward Heath who, as Prime Minister, signed the Treaty of Rome and took Britain into Europe. Today, with more and more British citizens looking to Europe to establish their rights, Sir Edward's concern is that the Westminster Parliament is in danger of lagging behind its own people in its approach to Europe.
There hasn't been a good word said about the European Union in this country by the government for the last 15 years. Not one. And so people don't understand.
Isn't it the case that, for however good the reasons, that Westminster's power has been diminished quite substantially?
Yes. Our sovereignty has been pooled with the sovereignty of the other members of the Union. But we've still got our powers and the ministers who are there in taking the decisions. The right of veto, as it's always existed, still exists. It's on a limited number of subjects, but they are the main things, including new membership. On this question of sovereignty again, sovereignty exists for the benefit of the citizen. That's what it's there for. It's not there so that you put it down in the cellar with your gold reserves and take a candle down once a week to see if it's still there. And so as we're using our sovereignty in the Union for the benefit of people, it's a justifiable use. If we get an increase, as we have, an increase of trade with Europe from 27% to nearly 60% of our trade, well, that's jobs, that's benefits to the citizens. And the use of sovereignty in that respect is absolutely justified. And it's very interesting, the other European, the members of the European Union. It's very seldom we ever hear the question of sovereignty raised. They all know that we're part of a union, and that's a major step forward for Europe.
Coming in front of us as we head down towards Parliament Square, you'll see a statue of Sir Winston Churchill. Probably the most famous British man ever.
If Parliament is to come to terms with its diminishing role, its loss of authority to ministers, to the press, to the judges and to Europe, it must undertake a fundamental reappraisal of itself. Reform of hours and procedure are at last on the agenda, but that's only a start. Without radical change, Westminster risks becoming merely a historical monument, not a guardian of the people's interest.
I believe that what is required, in a funny way, is a real change of heart, of attitude, by politicians generally towards Parliament and its role. Not just ministers, backbenchers as well, on both sides.
And supposing that doesn't happen, as it isn't happening at present?
No, we'll muddle on as we've muddled on for years, no doubt. But in the legislative field, I think we are suffering. And perhaps this is one of the reasons why increasingly things are being handed over to Europe.
More and more, Parliament is just a kind of law-making, law-checking agency. And it's getting increasingly out of touch with people. I'm not particularly optimistic, but I must say, I hope with all my heart there will be an external storm such as promoted the widening of the franchise in the last century, and which in this century will be designed to bring Parliament back to an intimacy with the public it serves.